Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington. I'd like to welcome all of you to this briefing focusing on confrontation in the Gulf, unpacking recent escalations, and the prospects of US-Iran talks in terms of diffusing the situation. Today, we are pleased that C-SPAN is covering this event. So I would like to just simply, that's the reason I'm starting on time, because we have, I know, a few more people coming in typical afternoon at the press building. We'll welcome them when they get here. But I just would like to ask for your cooperation in terms of turning your phones off to make sure the ringing doesn't get broadcast to the whole C-SPAN audience worldwide, and to avoid as much as possible walking in front of the cameras. It doesn't look good for people in the middle of the conversation kind of going back and forth across from the camera view. Also, would like to announce that for those of you who are new at Arab Center, usually our questions and answers are done in writing. So anytime you have a question, feel free to just write down your name, identify yourself, and write your question. When you're ready, just raise your hand. Staff will collect those, pass them on to the chair of the panel, and then your question will be read and addressed. If you want it addressed to a specific panelist, please indicate that. And let me just say a couple of words quickly about the chairman of the panel, and then just the subject matter a little bit, and then turn it over to Dan. I am very pleased and honored that my colleague and good friend for many years, neither one of us would like to say how long, but has agreed to chair this panel, particularly with the fact, I mean, he's a colleague with us at the Arab Center and a professor at Georgetown and a long-time resident and active scholar in Washington dealing with these issues, Middle East in general, but particularly on this issue with U.S. policy toward Iran. I would like, for those of you who are interested, to recommend to you his most recent work for us. If you go on our website, arabcenterdc.org, his most recent papers, one on North Africa, on Tunisia, adjusting to the departure of Sibsi and trying to cope with the transition there, and also another one on the issue that the subject of today, a paper that was written a couple weeks before that on the subject of dealing with Iran. But let me just say that aside from being a non-resident fellow at Arab Center, Daniel Brumberg is the director of democracy and governance studies at Georgetown University. He's also a senior non-resident fellow at POMED, the Project on Middle East Democracy here in Washington. He did serve as an advisor and consultant, special advisor to the U.S. Institute of Peace for many years, between 2008 and 2015. He has worked in various advisory capacity to the U.S. government, including the State Department, the U.S. Agency for International Development, focusing particularly on his specialty, as I said, human rights, security sector reform, and governance issues. In terms of the subject matter, I mean, aside from the questions that are raised on the invitation and the announcement, and Dan will be talking a little bit more about that in a minute, but it's been kind of interesting for those of us who are following the dance that's taking place between Washington and Tehran, back and forth. It's a dizzying tennis match. diplomatic tennis match with, tit-for-tat aspect to it, which makes it sometimes very difficult to follow. And it's somewhat chaotic. I mean, clearly the parties have not connected yet in terms of taking the positive reaction many of us would like to see taken to diffuse a situation and prevent war from devastating the region, whether by intention or by mistake. But definitely the irresolution witnessed in Washington specifically, and also on the Iranian side, it makes you wonder, as my friend Trita Parsi this morning had an article, an op-ed piece, in which he said, is Trump accidentally triggering reconciliation in the Middle East? And it's kind of funny because my colleague, Imad Harb, who's also here at the center, the director of our research, just wrote a piece a week ago, which I welcome you to look it up on our website, called The Arabian Gulf Must Not Sleepwalk Toward War. And sadly enough, it looks like the region is sleepwalking in that direction. So the panel today will be focusing kind of between those two assessment. Is it triggering reconciliation, or is it sleepwalking in the wrong direction? With that said, I'd like to pass the microphone on to my friend Daniel Brumberg to proceed.
Okay, well, thank you, Khalil. That was a very gracious and generous introduction to the chair, and I very much appreciate it. It is true that we've been friends since graduate school, and I will not mention the year involved. But I'm really delighted to be here today. I'm looking forward to learning from my co-panelists. I have to say that I remain as mystified about the direction of U.S. foreign policy as so many of us. And I'm hoping, however, that in addition to obviously getting our insights, we can find some arenas where we might actually differ, because I think the tendency and understandably is often to converge rather than diverge, but we'll see how that goes. As Khalil said, we'll be taking questions. You'll write them down and bring them up here. I'll throw out the first question, abusing my role as chair, and from there we'll go and we'll take a look at the cards and your questions, and hopefully we'll have a very good discussion. Our panelists will talk roughly 10 minutes. My job, along with my colleagues from the Arab Center, is to enforce those rules 10 to 12 minutes vigorously so we can make sure to finish on time and have a good discussion. So without further ado, I'll just very briefly introduce the panelists in the order that they're going to be speaking, which is the order that's printed on your handout. Shireen Hunter, University Associate, Georgetown University, good place to be, I think. Ken Katzman, Congressional Research Service. Ken's been writing on issues of the Gulf for many years. Many of you will surely have followed his work. Assal Rad, who I've just met today, who is a research fellow, National Iranian American Council, and she is based in California, and happy to have you with us today. And last but certainly not least, my friend and colleague Barbara Slavin, who is Director and Non-Resident Senior Fellow of the Future of Iran Initiative, Atlantic Council. So without further ado, I think we'll begin with Shireen. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Dan. It seems to me that the order of speakers is that age goes before wisdom, since I am the oldest on the panel. But that also means that, I have been doing this whole Iran business, unfortunately for my sins, for 40 years, 40 arduous years, and arguing about this. I also, since academics are just like, the street peddlers, I just wanted to flag in terms of giving a bit more credentials and for my talk, my latest book, which is called Arab-Iranian Relations, Dynamics of Conflict and Accommodation. It's by Roman and Littlefield, available Amazon, everywhere. So having said that, let me just start a few points, raise a few points, and then hopefully we can have discussions later on. One of my earlier instructions was that how serious is the risk of war in the Persian Gulf? and what is, certainly what is Iran trying to do, and obviously the other side of the conflict, what is the United States is doing. I can say something with quite certainty that Iran doesn't want war. That is for certain. Whether or not the strategy that it's pursuing, including the so-called tit-for-tat escalation that was mentioned, is another matter, and that could happen. Wars generally happen sometimes because of cumulative effect of such actions. If, we have to remember history, certainly the First World War happened like that. Then Germany didn't have a plan to conquer Europe or the world. So there were a accumulation of certain actions that eventually went, out of hand and led to that. But Iran doesn't want war. This is that Ayatollah Khamenei, and let's be clear, increasingly the center of decision-making is around Ayatollah Khamenei and the IRGC. In fact, the IRGC now has become master of Iran. And I think that the sanctions that has been going on, particularly since the so-called crippling sanctions, as Hillary Clinton put it, has actually increased the power and especially the role of IRGC in the economy. And as the economic problems leads to potential for social tensions, the regime will have to resort to some kind of coercion, and I think this is where the IRGC and the Basij and so on will become more important. But therefore, if something comes from Khamenei, then I think we can credit that, whereas Hassan Rouhani, I feel very sorry for him, but increasingly he has become, like a bag carrier, not even a respected bag carrier. When I used to carry the bag of a minister, I was much better treated, frankly. But anyway, so I think that that is something that we have to keep in touch. Iran doesn't want war. On the other hand, he has also said that we don't want talks. Now, once in a while, Rouhani and Zarif, that now, I don't want to get into that, others may talk about that, but if the time comes, I'll say my take on what's happening there, is that he also has said that we don't want talks. Of course, as I said, Foreign Minister Zarif and sometimes President Rouhani have come and said, yes, if the Americans return to the JCPOA, we will talk. But that is, obviously, I don't think that the Trump administration is going to return to JCPOA in order to have talks with Iran, unfortunately. I think it would be wise, but I don't think so. So maybe some, in between measures that can be agreed upon, but I don't know. But I don't think that that is going to very much to happen. The other thing that I think increasingly happening is that this is something we have to keep in mind. The issues and problems in the Persian Gulf are becoming almost, much, much more internationalized than they had been before. This is in part because the Trump administration, together with this policy of more aggressive policy towards Iran, has also picked fights with both China and Russia. And these are, and the one thing that to me personally, I am of a generation of Iranians and I come from a region that has been very much pressured by Russia historically for at least 300 years. Something that to me is very alarming is the growing closeness of Iran and Russia. If some rumors are to be believed that Iran might allow the Russian fleet bases in Bandar Abbas and Bushehr. If that happens, Peter the Great's dream would have become realized. So I think that as happened with the Syrian conflict, the things are becoming, it's no longer Iran versus United States, it's becoming internationalized. And I think that, they say that Iran and Russia are going to have joint maneuvers towards the end of this year. So we shall see what happens. So what I'm trying to say, the more we delay some kind of a compromise with Iran, the more this becomes internationalized, and we're going to get the more cooks wanting to get in stirring up the soup, and so that might be very difficult. Now, the other question that I was asked to address was that what would be, how devastating a war will be in the region. Well, it is quite obvious, as everybody has said, that Iran cannot win a conventional war in the sense of, bombings and so on and so forth. But, when you are fighting, for your life, or if you think that you are going to be destroyed or obliterated, I think as the word that President Trump used, then you're going to try to do whatever you can to extend the damage, and so use that. In fact, Iran's biggest deterrence, which of course is a double-edged sword, including with the Strait of Hormuz, the biggest deterrence is what I call the Samson option. In other words, if I'm going to go down, I'm going to bring the temple down with me. So I think that if indeed there is a war in the region, then Iranians, with whatever means they have, they are going to create as much chaos as possible. But most importantly, even if Iran doesn't do anything, the very fact of the shock of the war to global economy and so on is obviously going to negatively affect everybody globally, I would say, but certainly countries that are in the region are going to suffer a lot more. And I think that all the Iran strategy in the Persian Gulf, downing the so-called drone or taking ships and so on, is to show basically, and this is, I think, in this Iran is right. He says that, look, if you want to use the Strait of Hormuz, we have to use it too. And part of the using that is that we have to be able to have a living. And with all the sanctions and so on, our living is just completely disappeared. And let me add here, I just read a very interesting analysis about the so-called index or whatever, SVP or whatever. It's excellent. I never had any hope for this, but it shows a chapter and verse how this one cannot work. So I think that let's not be kind of complacent about the potential damage that the war can do in the surrounding areas. And I think that it may not be limited just to the Persian Gulf, and that definitely it would have impact in Iraq and so on. Yes, thank you, I would do that. And so I think that, yes, I think it will be quite damaging, and of course the US economy and all that, also global economy will think. Now, the other thing I would like here now to ask is that, so I think I covered the view from Iran, and now I'm going to talk about the talks. And let me first to say that talks really are not panacea. One of the things that I have been surprised in recent times is this, that there is a dichotomy has been created, which is a false dichotomy between war and diplomacy, as if the two are absolutely separate. War is a type of diplomacy, or at least, as Clausewitz says, is that war is diplomacy by other means. It means diplomacy is also a contest of power and how one can get what one wants. So the question becomes is that under what conditions any talks between Iran and the US can be how shall I say, productive, because here comes the issue of what the United States wants and what Iran is willing to get. When we talk about all this Iran's nefarious, which is again another thing that I like, why don't we call the way it is? What is it we are complaining Iran is doing? That Iran's nefarious regional activities is that. The most important problem, I think, is Iran's attitude towards the Arab-Israeli conflict and its actions in the Levant. whether it is the Hezbollah, whether it's the support for Hamas, whether it's, to me anywhere, unacceptable talk, although it's mostly talk about that, Israel does not have right to exist politically, not in the Middle East and so on. So these are really the main issues. And I think that a lot of the tensions in the Persian Gulf derives from that. And this has always been, there has always been a connection between the Levant and the Persian Gulf since the time of Nasser. And anyway, don't want to go too much into that. This is the problem of age. You have too many historical memories. So I think that as long as Iran is not willing to change policy in that, and I don't think that they are as yet, yes, they are as yet willing to do that, is going to be very difficult to talk. The Iranian regime doesn't show any sign that they are willing, to do that. They are willing to come to agreement with the Arab states, all Arab states, from Egypt to even Saudi Arabia. Recently, there has been a lot of talks, and even maybe bin Salman is changing. So that can be done. But that would mean delinking the Persian Gulf politics from the Levant politics. But this has been actually both the policy starting with George W. Bush that has created much greater linkage in this, and that frightening Arabs of Iran might make them more accommodating vis-a-vis Israel and so on. And I think Iran is just lost in this thing. They don't know what they are doing. The part of the problem is that Iran, unfortunately, and in an article recently, I argued that the Iranian regime, Islamic republics, needs a new basis for its political legitimacy and a new raison d'etre. I said they have to change the revolutionary framework into a framework that is basically national in concept. I don't mean nationalist, but national, which means that Iran's interest, Iran's safety, and Iran's prosperity should be their priority, and not a spread of, liberation of Palestine or whatever it is that they are doing. But the problem is, if that change happens, that would mean doing away with IRGC, doing away with Ayatollah Khamenei, and the whole lot of those clerical that have been basically, bleeding Iran dry. I will end it with this before my 2 minutes is up. I will end it with this, with a quote from the former commander of IRGC, General Jafari. He said, if we talk to America, nothing will remain of revolution. So the problem becomes here that we have to find a way of trying to delink Persian Gulf politics. And eventually, on time, things will work out. But as long as we keep this tension, and the other point, and I will finish that, the whole question of, for US too, the problem of Iran has become one of pride. Iran is, forgive me if I use this metaphor, but Iran is the rebellious satrapy that so far has escaped punishment. Iraq is gone, Syria more or less destroyed, and everything, but Iran has yet. So the problem is there are elements in the United States who really want Iran to cry uncle. Of course, they would prefer if they did that through talking. That's why you have 12-point. And this, I have to say here, that has been the constant policy of the United States, at least since 1988. I would go even to 87. So this is not merely a Trump problem. If we think it in terms of Trump, then it's going to be, and unfortunately, Iranians are thinking in terms of Trump. I keep telling them they shouldn't expect anybody else to do much better until and unless they change some of the basic issues. You cannot challenge a country and its interests. You cannot say we are going to drive United States out of Middle East and hope that they are going to give you the means to do that. So I think that this is what we are seeing, is the gradual, again, culmination of a crisis that has been going on for 40 years. I will stop here, and hopefully later in question and answer, I might add a couple of more things. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Hunter. I think you put your finger on one of the key issues here, and that is, of course, for the hardliners.
Yes.
Any relationship with the United States is existentially threatening. I mean, they cannot, for them, that would be the end of the revolution. So how can you compartmentalize this? And Obama's solution was to focus on the nuclear issue and try to break them apart. And now that particular policy has been jettisoned. So it's one question of where we go from here. And Ken, you may or may not be willing to engage that particular issue, but I know that you have prepared some remarks, so go right ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you to the Arab Center. Sometimes I am in a CRS capacity, sometimes I'm not in a CRS capacity. Today, I am not in a CRS capacity. I will be speaking in English.
That's good. I like that.
So I think Shireen was correct that Iran does not want war. However, in my estimation, my analysis, Iran is probably in the strongest position I have seen it in many years. They have basically rescued Assad from the brink of extinction. Hezbollah is stronger than it has ever been. Iraqi Shia militias are in many ways the preponderant power in Iraq. The UAE has now left Yemen, leaving the Saudi campaign against the Iran-backed Houthis hanging by a thread. Iran has backed the Houthis, that's very clear. And so Iran does not want war, I totally agree. However, Iran, as we said, it is being strangled by sanctions. Its oil exports are approximately 10% of the baseline of 2.5 million barrels a day. It is shut out of the international banking system. And it's estimated that its GDP will sink about 6 or 7% this year, which, if the US shrank about 6 or 7%, that would be a severe recession, not a mild recession. That would be a severe recession. And so Iran is feeling, in my estimation, extremely confident that it can make a tremendous amount of trouble for the United States if there is a conflict. And Iran is going to go to the mat to try to achieve the lifting of sanctions. A succession of mediators appear to have taken their chance at the plate and struck out. There is not a tremendous amount of active mediation that is appearing to bear fruit. And I want to talk a little about the fact that this puts a big burden, I would say, on the European countries who continue to support the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement. They feel this was a victory for European diplomacy. They saw no real credible rationale for the US to leave the accord. They are trying mightily to preserve it. They may succeed, they may not. I want to talk a little about what they're trying to do and what others are trying to do to keep this agreement in place and perhaps salvage the situation and maybe pull us back from the brink of conflict, which I think is the point of our meeting today, is to talk about, are we at the brink of conflict and maybe how it could be avoided. So Shireen mentioned INSTEX, which is the Instrument for Support of Trading Exchanges. It is a European Union vehicle, a sort of a barter exchange. Basically, the Europeans have started it. It is processing transactions. It has not yet completed a transaction. It is so far limited to humanitarian affairs issues, goods which are not sanctionable under US sanctions law. It is a vehicle whereby basically European exporters to Iran will be paid by European importers, and Iranian exporters will be paid by Iranian. The money stays on each side of the divide, basically. So the money doesn't go from Iran to Europe or Europe to Iran. It stays on each side of the divide, and therefore, presumably, it avoids dollar transaction. It avoids sanctionability. That's the thesis. Now, it's had difficulty. It's going to have difficulty. The Europeans are considering a number of ways to try to make it more effective and maybe make it viable. They are considering expanding it to oil transactions. Very difficult because under U.S. law, indirect transactions, if somebody buys Iranian oil, that is a sanctionable transaction. Whether it went through Instex or not, it is whoever took the delivery of Iranian oil could be subject to U.S. sanctions. So oil may be a little difficult, but it's under discussion. The other near-term option that's being explored is that the Europeans appear to be exploring a plan where they will basically pump capital into the transaction. They will make advance payments to European exporters so that they're not waiting for Iran importers to pay. It's a little hard. I'm trying to make sense of it myself, but it looks like what the Europeans are doing is trying to pump capital into the mechanism to accelerate it. The other issue that's under discussion is for others outside Europe to join this vehicle. China is talking about joining the vehicle. Obviously, China very flush with cash. Other ideas, China still does buy Iranian oil. Yes, they buy a lot less than they were. However, if you watch CNBC, you know that the U.S. and China are in a very, very significant trade conflict now. Is it beyond thought that China, as a way of messaging the Trump administration, might try to buy more Iranian oil? That certainly is on the table, I would say. China has basically said they are going to continue to buy Iranian oil. There was a Chinese company sanctioned last week, USIran. Okay, I'll have to look up the name. It's something like this. They were sanctioned a few years ago for selling gasoline to Iran. It's a minor Chinese company. It was now sanctioned last week for transactions with Iran. Zenran Zuhai, I think it is. Yes, sir. Then let me just briefly discuss another idea that's out there. Even though I'm not in a CRS capacity today, I do not recommend options. That is not what I'm doing. I can talk about options and debate them, but I cannot recommend anything. But another idea that's out there is, so after the Trump administration left the JCPOA last year, the Europeans, the EU, announced a $20 million development aid to Iran, development grant. $20 million is a very small amount. Iran is out maybe $40 or $50 billion a year because of the oil. To make Iran whole for the JCPOA, they would need to be staked to about $40 or $50 billion, is my estimation. Can the Europeans simply pump that much cash into the Iranian economy, 40, 50 billion a year? Tough, probably not. Could China pump half of that? Probably yes. Is injecting capital into the Iranian economy through cash grants, loans, is that sanctionable? I don't see that it is. There is a sanction for countries that aid countries on the terrorism list, which Iran is on the terrorism list. There would be a U.S. sanction, which would be to cut aid to that country. China does not get U.S. aid. The Europeans do not get U.S. aid. So I do not see a way that pumping capital into the Iranian economy would be sanctionable. I'm not an attorney, and I'm not, this is sort of my first blush assessment. So these are ideas that are out there. The Europeans did pump some capital, I believe, into the Turkish economy for the refugee issue. Again, I'm not speaking on Turkey. I don't cover Turkey. So I think my point is there are ideas out there. Am I saying the JCPOA can be salvaged? I'm not assessing that at that time. That's not my base case right now. Are there ideas that are being explored? Yes. Could these ideas potentially salvage the situation? Possibly. And I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that's it's really sobering because I think one recognizes that Iran's regime depends on the sale of oil. And if you can't sell oil, you have a gun put to your head, essentially. So if none of these arrangements work out, particularly in terms of oil sales, Iran has very few options. Walking away completely from the agreement is certainly one option that's out on the table now, and escalating in the Gulf as response predictable to this situation. So I think that's really very important. All right, Assal, thank you.
I'd like to thank Arab Center for giving me the opportunity and the platform to share with such respected people in the field. I'm going to take a slightly different approach to what we're talking about and talk about sort of the framing of the issue. And the reason I take that approach is I think one of the things that's informed the way we have a discussion, and I believe that a discussion like this is very important, but it's important to have because hopefully what we're trying to gain at the end of the discussion is a resolution, or else, this is just an exercise in us talking. So if what we're trying to gain is a resolution, we have to have a full understanding of where the problem comes from and where it stems from, and how we talk about it is actually quite important. The framing that we've seen in Washington and what we've seen in the media very often, and this stems for the last 40 years when it comes to Iran specifically, but also talking about the broader Middle East, is we have a baseline assumption that Iran is a bad actor and the US is a good actor. And when we talk about it in this sort of useless dichotomy, we don't really get any nuance into discussing why is Iran behaving the way that it is. If we continue to say Iran is behaving this way because they're bad actors, then we have no way of actually gaining a resolution because we're assuming they're irrational actors. But if you look at what's happened over the last year, what you'll see is actually a very rational sort of approach from the Iranian side. There's also sort of a bizarre paradox in talking about Iran, where on one hand we have the argument that it's so powerful, that its hand is in every pot in the Middle East, that it's controlling everything. And yet, it's so weak that we can, one or two strikes, take them out. And so that paradox is, again, problematic in finding any kind of a resolution. The interesting thing about the paradox is it's actually seeped in a history of Orientalism, right? This is the exact type of Orientalist discourse that has long been used, talking about the Orient as being docile, weak, effeminate even, and simultaneously hypermasculine, aggressive, and dangerous. And so this is not something that's new to the discourse. It's something that we've repeatedly seen. And in the same reason why Orientalism impeded our ability to really have a conversation if we were talking about people as equal partners and trying to gain a resolution, it's still problematic in this framing as well. So I've talked about why I think the framing is important, because we're trying to gain a resolution. And today, what I want to talk about is today we have two threats that are global and can threaten our species. One is climate change, and the other is nuclear weapons. What the JCPOA did is addressed not climate change, but addressed the idea that both of these things require global cooperation. The JCPOA is a model for global cooperation. On top of that, it's a model for non-proliferation. So it really should have been something that rather than abandoning it, it should have been something that we used as a model to how to denuclearize the entire Middle East, to make sure that this is a model that's used globally, and to actually tackle the problems that we're going to face in the next 10, 20, 50 years. We're seeing data that's coming out of the United Nations that talks about food scarcity, water scarcity, and these are the problems that we really should be focused on, rather than having what is, in my opinion, a sideshow about Iran, and how Iran is, again, simultaneously an existential threat and no threat at all because we can take them out very easily. The crisis that we're currently in is first based on that kind of framing, and that's why we see the Trump administration have an incoherent policy, right? We don't have a coherent framing to have a coherent policy. The other reason we have an incoherent policy is because his policy advisors are not aligned with his vision. We've talked about now, Iran doesn't want a war, right? And I agree, absolutely. Iran does not want a war. The violations that we've seen, the small breaches that are calculated that Iran has gone through in the last few months are easily reversible. And if Iran wanted to abandon the deal, they could have followed suit with the US over a year ago. They didn't, because they actually want to stay in the deal. They do not want a war. I believe President Trump has made it clear that he doesn't want a war. Unfortunately, his advisors arguably do. And so incoherent policy is coming out of the fact that they have a vision that's not aligned. The way out, if we're talking about, and we'll get into this more, I think, when we have questions and answers, but I think there's some concern of, well, Iran has said that they don't want any talks. Khamenei has said that they don't want any talks. And I think Shireen brought up an IRGC official who said, if we talk to the US, nothing will remain of the revolution. And while that mentality is certainly potent within the hardliners in Iran, of course, Iran did negotiate with the US. They did talk to the US. We did have a nuclear agreement. And so it's not that it's an impossibility to return to that status quo, it's that we as the United States are not acting in a way that would make that possible. And again, if we go back to the original point that I made, if we look at the Iranian side as a rational actor, we see 1 year of doing absolutely nothing but complying with the deal because they wanted to stay within the deal. This is what we call strategic patience. When Iranians, and we wanted to, I believe Dan wanted to talk about the view from Tehran. I spent personally 10 years in Iran doing field research during my PhD program. And from my understanding, at least from someone who's done field research in Iran, Iranians are suffering currently under sanctions. And while they absolutely have rightful dissent and disagreement and disdain even for the government that they have, what the United States' approach is doing is actually helping them to unify behind something they don't even necessarily like. And that's the thing that's actually so frustrating as someone who is an Iranian American and part of the diaspora to watch occur. So you see people who are outspokenly against that government now thinking, well, at least they're protecting us, right? So we see things like drone strikes, tanker seizures. And again, if the assumption is the frame that Iran is the aggressor, then that's the problem in not understanding why they're behaving the way that they are. In fact, our drones are close to Iran. Our bases are close to Iran. None of this is taking place anywhere close to the United States. And so from their point of view, this is something I heard from a friend in Iran after the drone strike. They were happy to know that they could defend their borders. A war in Iran is not something that is a far-fetched memory, right? War on their soil occurred in the 1980s, and a generation was defined by that war, and they still remember it, and they still understand it. And the fear of not being able to defend their borders was a very potent fear. And so now what they're seeing is their government having stepped up and being able to defend their borders is not something that's seen negative, nor would it be by any rational actor. We would never want to feel that our borders are not being protected by our government. So what I'm hoping is in the rest of the conversation that we can have, we can get into more details of how we can actually move forward. But I do believe that the point of origin has to be the United States, because the point of origin that put us on this path was a decision by the United States, by this administration, to abrogate the deal. And if we want to go back and talk to Iran if we want to negotiate a more for more deal, then we have to go back to the origin, reconcile that. On the Iranian side, they have to come back to full compliance if the United States actually ends its maximum pressure campaign, and then you can have a discussion about more for more. So I'll end there.
Well, thank you very much. That was tremendous. It seems to me that whatever the long-term framing of Iran and the U.S. is bad actor, good actor, the D.C. framing these days is that the Trump administration has provoked this problem. And in that sense, it's not a positive actor, and Iran is acting as the rational actor. I think that this seems to be the widespread point of view. Maybe Fox News doesn't share that point of view, but I think that the narrative is to suggest that the ending or the decision by the U.S. to exit the Iran nuclear deal was the precipitating factor of getting us to where we are now today. Barbara.
I'm not sure there's much left for me to talk about, but let me try very briefly. And first, thank the Arab Center and thank my co-panelists. I agree with a lot of what they've said. I wrote a piece the other week for the Axios website that said basically that when it comes to Iran, the means has become the end. And I think that's what we've seen from the Trump administration. There is disagreement within the administration about Iran policy, although not as much as there was at the beginning of the Trump administration, when you had people like Jim Mattis and Rex Tillerson and H.R. McMaster actively urging the president to stay in the nuclear deal. The president fired those advisors, got new advisors who were more hawkish on Iran. But there are disagreements over whether military action should be taken. National Security Advisor John Bolton, in particular, is quite hawkish, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also more hawkish, apparently, than the president. But the one thing they all seem to agree on is sanctions. more and more and more sanctions. And of course, it's not just Iran. I mean, if you've been following Venezuela, now Venezuela is under an embargo as well. To me, it represents a sense of frustration on the part of the administration that their policy isn't working. Iran has not returned to the table. There are no negotiations on a new and better deal. And if you remember the 12 demands that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo put forward a little more than a year ago, Iran's policies and activities in all those areas are arguably much worse than they were when the United States was still in the deal. When the U.S. was still in the deal, there weren't tankers that were being sabotaged in the Persian Gulf. There weren't tankers that were being seized, drones being shot down. Yes, Iran was very active in the region, but I would argue that has more to do with U.S. mistakes like invading Iraq and opening Iraq to Iranian influence than it did to some sort of diabolical Iranian hegemonic impulse. So all of Iran's nefarious behavior, malign behavior has gotten worse since the United States left the deal. And of course, it makes perfect sense because Iran is signaling that it is not going to sit there and have its economy completely choked off and have the international community pay no price. So what's surprising is that Iran was patient for a year until the United States decided that it was going to issue no more waivers for Iranian oil exports, that it would try to reduce Iran's oil exports to zero. So all of this quite predictable. Sanctions, sanctions, and more sanctions. Last week was simply the height of absurdity. The United States, which claims that it wants new negotiations with Iran, sanctioned the one individual who would lead such negotiations, namely the Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. Not only did they sanction him, but on their Farsi website, they put out an item that had an extremely ugly picture of Zarif. He was actually in a fight with hardliners at the time, but his face is all screwed up and he looks very, very angry and menacing. And the text in Farsi called Zarif a very rude word in Persian, essentially called him a pimp for the Iranian government. Now, I ask you, if you want to have negotiations with an adversary, is this the way you go about it? Is this designed to encourage negotiations? One of the big questions we have now is whether Javad Zarif or even Hassan Rouhani will come to the UN Security Council for the annual meeting of the General Assembly in September. Will the United States provide the visas? Will it give permission in time so they can make their preparations? Will it impose such humiliating conditions that Iran will boycott the UN General Assembly in September? It's entirely possible, in which case any chance for diplomacy and de-escalation goes out the window. So I think that U.S. policy, like many other policies undertaken by this administration, is maximum noise, maximum pressure, and minimum result. Things get worse, they don't get better, and we don't find solutions. As somebody who's been following Iran also for 40 years, although perhaps less intimately than Shireen Hunter, this is very frustrating because we were in a better place, and has been pointed out. Not only did we have negotiations with Iran during the period that led to the JCPOA, but actually there have been talks with Iran under almost every administration, one sort or another. Sometimes they've been covert, sometimes they've been overt, but there have been talks and there have been efforts at de-escalation. And what we have now is a situation where there are no talks, there are no channels, and we are putting sanctions on the foreign minister of the country. Last point, and this is a quotation from Lewis Carroll, that I first heard applied to Iran by John Limbert, a former U.S. hostage in Iran, also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iran, and one of my favorite people. And it goes like this: when you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there.
Well, thank you very much. I'm gonna lead off with a question, but I invite everybody to, anybody who wants to ask a question, please write it down on the card, and my colleagues from the Arab Center will be collecting them and bringing them up here. And one of the things that Barbara said about sanctions is sanctions have two purposes. One is to force or encourage your adversary to come to the negotiating table, and the other is to destroy your adversary. I mean, if the purpose of sanctions is to engage in a strategy of regime change, of course, Iran has no incentive at all to come to the table, and we're all sitting up here scratching our heads wondering exactly what is the policy coming from the administration in that regard. And here's my question on that particular score, and that is, where's Trump in all this? I mean, this sounds like perhaps an odd question, but it's an interesting situation where when you're apparently 10 or 15 minutes from an attack, a U.S. attack, we learn that our president's decided it's not a good idea. My sense, and I've written about it, is that his inclination is not to make war, and that he probably would rather negotiate if he could. He just doesn't know how to get there, and particularly since he's surrounded by people who don't necessarily agree with him. So my question for Barbara and anybody else on the panel who wishes to address this is, what do we make of this? I'm not even sure how to characterize it, this strange bifurcation in the White House. I mean, is it possible for this administration to actually negotiate? Is it possible for Trump to find his way towards offering negotiations and not take steps, as Barbara just described, that completely upend any idea that we could possibly have such talk? So Barbara, anybody else, I'm trying to look into the soul of this administration and understand what the prospects are here, which is, after all, partly what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, I think one thing, well, I'll start and we'll maybe go in opposite order down the line. One thing we have to stress is how much this is a domestic political issue for Trump. He left the Iran nuclear deal because his supporters supported that. They wanted more pressure on Iran. They wanted sanctions on Iran. Saudi Arabia wanted it, the Emirates wanted it, the Israelis wanted it, and the big donors to Trump's campaign wanted more pressure on Iran. So it's domestic politics for him, and I don't think, I can't see him coming back into the JCPOA. I can't see him making concessions toward Iran that would make it easier for Iran to agree to new talks. You have to put something face-saving down on the table for Iran to return to the talks and not simply try to wait at least until our 2020 elections, because we should point out that all the Democratic candidates, with the exception of Cory Booker, have said pretty much that they would return to the JCPOA if there is a JCPOA to return to, which gives Iran an incentive to try to hunker down and somehow stay within some aspects of the deal until 2020. It's hard to imagine. The sanctions on Zarif, our colleague Robin Wright wrote in The New Yorker that Rand Paul, who's another one of the emissaries to the Iranians, met with Zarif when he was in New York and invited him to the White House. And when Zarif said he would have to check with his government before he could come, and pretty much turned down the request, he was sanctioned. And according to Zarif, he was threatened with sanctions if he didn't come to the Oval Office. I mean, these are mafia tactics. These aren't the tactics of a great superpower. And again, what's in it for Iran? If Trump will make no concessions, if they won't even restore any of the oil waivers to Iran, why should they return to talks? There's simply no rationale for it that I can see. I don't know what the others think. Yeah.
May I add just a couple of footnotes to this? I may be a little bit of I wouldn't use the word dissent because that is a bit too strong. But I do believe that Iran-US problems go beyond Trump. Trump is the culmination of a process that started, and frankly, on this, I have to say, depending who started what, it depends when in history you want to start. I mean, there are a lot of things that depends on the date you choose. I think the first salvo was from Iran. And that was first the hostage crisis, and then there was the Ayatollah Khomeini's thing. And of course, the sanctions started first, well, the early sanctions because of hostages, but after that it started under the Clinton administration. In my humble opinion, United States lost the best opportunities to actually have a comprehensive talk with Iran, and that the best time was in 1988. And I know this for a fact. I don't want to go into that. Iran was very traumatized. The Iraqi troops were still in Iranian territory, and they had indicated to the United States that if they got Iraqi troops out of the Iranian territory, they were willing to have all kinds of things. And the other thing was during the first Bush administration that Rafsanjani, those days, was very powerful. Now there is no counterweight to Khamenei. Khamenei was nobody in the early 1990s, to a sense, and IRGC didn't have the current power. But we rebuffed Rafsanjani. The last time was Khatami. Barbara has herself written about it, and I liked the book immensely. And then was the 2003 thing, if you have gone. The US policy actually consistently has been regime change without war, except for the brief period that the euphoria of the Afghan and Iraqi wars, that I remember I read an article who said that the real men go to Tehran, which was that we should have first gone to Tehran and not Baghdad. And so a number of things changed because of that, but Iran was on the hit list. Now, I have said this, so Trump is the culmination of all this stuff. Now, let me say on the other side that what is happening with the Khamenei and all that, and probably this will be my last contribution. The problem that I have personally, as someone who puts Iran ahead of Islam or any other religion or whatever, the survival of Iran and its prosperity for me is the most important one. Khamenei sees himself as the leader of an Islamic world. I read just one Friday prayer imam saying Islam is universalist. They look at Iran as if it were a staging post for going after this. That's why I'm very worried about the IRGC. I think the people who consider war, whether by accident or design, to remember that a minority of them may actually want an apocalyptic war. I mean, increasingly, with all the pressures, one thing that is very troubling to me, increasingly people are talking, getting ready for the coming of the Messiah. So I think that you have to understand, they go, and of course, it is the Khamenei's personality. The same way with Trump, Khamenei is very stubborn. Khamenei is very proud, and I don't think that he cares. We missed opportunities to deal with Rafsanjani and we deal with Khatami and even with Rouhani, and so we have to do that. It requires for the United States, it seems to me, if they really want to, and the other thing is, of course, the United States, really, and it started with Clinton, but Clinton started it without use of military force. It started on what I call a transformative policy for Middle East. You can't transform a region completely. It's not a mechanical thing. It's not a puzzle that you move just, and it has therefore unleashed a dialectic process that we are here. So to get back, it seems to me one way of doing things is also to look at Iran as Assal said, as part of this bigger Middle East puzzle, and I think that. My one recommendation will be to try to reach agreements, even without open talks, on specific issues with Iran. For example, about the shipping in the Persian Gulf, or about, and the one step will be to allow the process of reconciliation between Iran and the Gulf Arabs to go forward. For that, I think Iran is ready. And even Zarif said that we have no problem even with Saudi Arabia. And then they can build upon that and hopefully. You see, we have always put preconditions for Iran. Rather than looking at it as a process, the end of which will be Iran is stopping its nefarious activities and all the other things. But if you go a priori, the Clinton administration did that and others did that, that you have to accept these things, then we can talk. But that's not negotiation. That's basically demanding surrender. And I think that really is very difficult with any kind of party.
I wanted to add to the question that you had about Trump specifically and how he sort of fits into the picture. So I think this is fascinating because he wanted to coin the phrase "you're fired." So it seems like it's possible for him, if he wanted to, as he's done so many times already in his administration, fire the people who are guiding his policies. To be fair, he's not a policy expert. I don't think anybody is under the impression that he is. And so he's being fed information by people who he's entrusted with guiding his policies, where he doesn't know really what to do. So I think at a certain point, it is really incumbent on him, if he genuinely doesn't want a war, which is what he says, to fire the people who are putting him on that path and bring advisors like Tillerson, who at the beginning wasn't putting him on that path, which is why he argued that we should remain in the JCPOA. So I really think that that's, a sort of maybe simplified way of looking at it, but just being advised by people who actually have the same vision as you would be the path that Trump should take if he wants to fit into this. It really does question his authority on this issue when he claims one thing, when he says, I don't want war, I just want Iran not to have nuclear weapons, and yet we had an agreement that prevented exactly that, and we pulled out of that agreement. So to get cohesion, he needs to find people who have the same vision as him.
Yeah.
Just to round it out, button it up, I think the administration, from what they say, seems to believe that the maximum pressure is weakening Iran to the point where its regional activities are diminishing or will diminish. And I wrote a piece actually for Barbara's group, and I don't see evidence of that weakening or that Iran has shifted any of its activities in the region, and I don't see any evidence that Iran's economy is about to collapse or that Iran will capitulate because of economic downturn. Let's remember, the Iraqis basically shut off Iran's oil exports entirely during the Iran-Iraq war. So if we talk about getting Iran to zero, the Iraqis had it at zero, and it did not collapse. It rationed food, it rationed goods, but it did not collapse. So I think we have to, as analysts, look at whether the thesis that you can weaken Iran to the point where it surrenders is valid, and I would say I don't see evidence for that right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's important also to note that the Iranians see that President Trump, not only does he not want another war in the Middle East, but he wants to withdraw all U.S. forces from the Middle East. You remember it was only last December he said the U.S. was completely withdrawing from Syria, and later backtracked on that. Now he has his envoy trying to get an agreement with the Taliban so the U.S. can drastically withdraw troops from Afghanistan. So, yes, there's maximum economic pressure, but the U.S. is not really eager to put boots on the ground, which is another reason for the Iranians to continue to test the United States with provocative actions in the Persian Gulf, to pressure Europe, to pressure the Chinese, the Russians, and others, and to essentially wait out Trump.
Thank you very much. I have to say that Ken's article was highly recommended reading.
Iran's source at the Atlantic Council website.
It reminds us of the strange idea that if a country somehow is having economic troubles, it's expected to stop defending its national interests, which is a very bizarre assumption to bring it. Here's an interesting question that I'll read for you. President Macron proposed an initiative in Iran and acting as mediator between the U.S. and Iran, and a number of other countries have proposed playing that role. Trump tweeted today that Tehran is given mixed signals, including from Macron. He insisted that nobody can represent the U.S. Does this mean that mediation is doomed? What do you make of this statement? This is for Ken and Barbara.
Is this something that's just been tweeted today? He's stopped beating up on on Beto O'Rourke. And yeah. Trump wants a photo op meeting with an Iranian. You know, this is a real clear goal. He wants to replay the tape with North Korea, not that that's gone so well. But, you know, maximum pressure, fire and fury, and then, you know, summits with thousands of the world's press in attendance. That's what he wants with Iran. But the situations are so different. I mean, first of all, North Korea is really a one-man dictatorship. Iran is not. Iran has politics. It has foreign policy making through consensus. And, you know, what's the percentage for Iran? Iran is already a major power in that part of the world. It doesn't need legitimization from Donald Trump in the same way that, you know, a 33-year-old North Korean, you know, descendant, grandson of the founder of the regime needed legitimization by Donald Trump. So it's simply not there. Also the region in Northeast Asia wants peace and wants North Korea to be brought out, you know, and reintegrated into the region. And at least until recently, the feelings in the Middle East were very, very different. I think if there is a hopeful sign, I agree with my co-panelists, it's that the United Arab Emirates has sent an emissary to Iran. Even the Saudis seem to be toning down the rhetoric somewhat. If the region understands that Donald Trump is not going to save them, is not going to get rid of the hated regime in Tehran, that they're going to be stuck with this regime for a long time, maybe they can sit down and start to sort out some of their problems together. You know, Trump has shown that he simply cannot be counted on to solve the problem of Iran for the region.
Thank you. Yes, and I would add to that, when you're playing a game of chicken and you're hoping that threats of U.S. action will bring Iran to compliance and it doesn't do this, you're left having to rethink your whole approach, and it's probably what they're doing in Dubai right now, just reconsidering if that's going to work out, because otherwise, because it doesn't seem that the U.S. is going to necessarily go to war, or that Iran will certainly take the bait. Here's an interesting specific question for which I have no clear guidance for. Anybody who knows about this can jump into it. An American aircraft carrier battle group has been treading water in the Arabian Sea just outside the Straits of Hormuz for 2 months now. Could it be that it is afraid to enter the Gulf for fear of being a sitting duck? And the bigger question, I suppose, is, you know, what is the U.S. strategy in the Gulf? We haven't really talked very much about what's going on there, and that's really a murky subject. So, Ken or anybody else who wants to jump in?
I mean,
this,
I think
please.
the aircraft doesn't necessarily have to be in the Gulf to be effective. I mean, I think the issue is, what I look at is these deployments that have been announced since May, and there's been several batches, including deployments of some advanced combat aircraft, additional air defense weaponry. U.S. forces are back at Prince Sultan Air Base, where they haven't been since 2003. The question is are these deployments deterring Iran? And I would have to say not yet, because Iran is still attacking tankers and seizing tankers. So this is where this goes back to what I started with when I gave my talk, was that Iran feels very confident because they can make so much trouble for the United States at this point that, you know, they are emboldened to push the envelope to get what they want. And, you know, obviously what I say to people, you know, anybody that thinks that a U.S.-Iran war is going to stay limited to the Strait of Hormuz is just not looking at what I'm looking at, or I think anybody in this panel has been looking at. So I think we have to get away from this notion that any conflict with Iran is going to stay limited to some sort of a classic clash in the Strait of Hormuz.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm gonna take this opportunity to throw out an Iran-related question that echoes some of the other questions here, and that is, in terms of Rouhani and Zarif, you know, do they have, given this, they bet their whole career, Zarif bet his whole career on this deal. I mean, some of us were there in 2013 at the meeting in New York City, and Zarif was bouncing off the walls. He was so happy. He was so, I mean, it was a new day. They were coming back, the reform. I mean, they felt that the history was with them. And here we are all these years later, And, does Zarif, Rouhani, the different forces they represent, do they have a future? How do they survive this very difficult situation in which they've placed all their bets on this particular agreement, and now it seems to be possibly to be dissolving before their eyes?
May I answer this
Sure,
question? I think that I was going to write an article, but then I got busy. I didn't. It was going to be Zarif between Trump and a hard place, hardliners. You have to see the history of Zarif. I think that I have known Javad Zarif since he was at least interning at the Iranian mission. This was again, that's why when you're old, you remember things a lot more. And so there's no mystery. And I always liked him. I thought he was very personable. He certainly is very bright and so on. But Zarif fumbled twice. One of the first Zarif fumbles was in the Bonn negotiations after the U.S. Invasion of Afghanistan. We basically gave the house key to the Americans and got rid of the legitimate government, according to the United Nations, of Rabbani, and allowed Hamid Karzai come to there. This was the victory of Javad Zarif, that he really was, and I think because he speaks English fluently, he impresses this Revolutionary Guards and others that have never learned a foreign language, at least not to be able to, really be fluent. And so that was the one thing. And I think that what happened after that Iran diplomacy of basically concession, I personally was opposed to what they did in the Bonn conference. They basically gave away Afghanistan, any say in Afghanistan at that Bonn meeting. And I think that contributed greatly to the victory of Ahmadinejad. For the first time, foreign policy became an issue in the Iranian presidential elections. Larijani and so on, what they called the siyasat infiali, the concessionary foreign policy. The other thing that obviously, in fact, someone very close to me the other day was very closely reading JCPOA, and he said that didn't Iranians have some proper lawyers to look at this agreement? He says it is full of loopholes of things, and that what has been done. So what I'm saying is, therefore, as a result of this, and the last, obviously, coup de grace was the withdrawal from JCPOA. And the calls for Zarif's resignations and so on and so forth. But the Iranian government needs Zarif because they don't have a strong enough foreign ministry. I mean, they should have 200 Zarifs. Instead, they have just this one guy that can actually interact with others. So, therefore, what Zarif essentially had to do in order to, I was worried actually about him. I thought that, his life might be in danger. I thought he should stay in one of his trips. And no, really. And so, therefore, I think that what Zarif has been doing, and he has been doing quite a bit of tongue lashing himself. I had never seen him. Some of the gestures he has been doing and the stuff that he's saying is very unrealistic but he has been doing it, embracing Saddar Soleimani visiting him at the foreign ministry and so on and so forth. So this is really for him is a self-protection. Does Zarif has a future in Iran? Yes. In fact, he has now cut his deal with the thing, and he has become a hero. He has become a national hero.
Because of the sanctions.
Because of the sanctions and because of all this thing. In fact, he had to go and say that I promise you that I will not run in 1,400 the Iranian year. So yes, there is. But you see, the problem is, again, I will come back and then I will close. United States, I don't want to go too much into history. We mishandled the policy vis-a-vis Iran in the 1970s, especially from 75 to 79. Let's face it. Our policies contributed to the mess Iranian Revolution. And that was the biggest strategic loss for the United States, frankly, even worse than the loss of China and whatever. And there is still the ripples of that thing. And if we have a war with Iran, and even if Iran is disintegrated, the ripples of that also will continue another 50 years or something like that. So we have to be very careful what we are talking. And it's not because Iran is such a big deal or such a wonderful thing. No, none of that. But it's where it sits. And where it sits, and because of that, something like that collapsing, everything is not going to remain the same. Wherever it is, it's not going to remain the same. So we have to be very, careful with that. The problem is we have never wanted to deal with Iran slowly. And that comes to the dynamics of, I don't think it's so, partly Orientalism, I think Assal is correct, the mindset of how we view these people. They only understand force. You got to kick them in the ass before they can, do that's basically, But beyond that, I think, without being pejorative towards anybody, these are the dynamics of great power behavior. One of the problems of Iran and the United States, and also Russia, I'm very upset that the Iranians are accepting Russian imperialism but fighting American so-called imperialism. To me, Russian imperialism is worse. So the point, it is definitely worse. So the point I'm trying to say is this: Iran challenge, it has been challenging all the time, even when it was very weak. For example, the Amir Kabir, he wanted to buy ships and came to America. They asked the American ambassador in Constantinople that U.S. should sell ships to Iran because they wanted to patrol the Persian Gulf, because the British were using anti-slavery in order to control all of what was piracy coast and became the trucial states. So it is the dynamics of great powers and regional power. So some of these things is that, I don't want to use it again in a pejorative way, but United States wants global hegemony, and certainly wants it in the Middle East. And Iran is challenging that hegemony. So Iranians, if you make your bed, you have to lie in it. I am not saying that the US has a right to hegemony, no. But Iran also has to realize that it cannot fight with the United States and expect not to be punished. This is going to happen. And so it seems to me that, the French have an expression, and I have to confess my basic formation is French, and the Anglo-Saxon sort of veneer is there. But the French have a word, and it says that at the end of the day, il faut trancher. At the end of the day, you have to slice things. In other words, you have to go question de fond, the fundamental issues. Anglo-Saxon thing is by contrast, because I studied in England, is by contrast. No, if we just wishy-washy, we will get somewhere. But it doesn't work. And I believe Iran-US relations has reached a level of that it has to be tranché. And I think that either US accept Iran as a regional player, and then in exchange for that, Iran also has to become a more responsible player, not going around talking about, destroying a country or doing this stuff. Or we are going to see, more of the same, even after Khamenei and Trump have gone.
Thank you. Well, in light of the tranché challenge. Oh, yes, please.
Is it okay if I
please.
just add to this part? Because you framed it as talking about sort of Rouhani and Zarif and whether Zarif has a future given, you talked about him bouncing off of the walls, right? And I think that something to bring up while we're having these conversations that are only focused on sort of the leadership, Zarif was not the only one bouncing off of walls. Iranians were. The Iranian populace was happy to have the JCPOA. There is, and while there is some conversations that try to deny that, it is an undeniable fact. In terms of polling, if you look at the elections in 2017 in Iran, 70% of the voting population voted, and Rouhani won by a landslide because of the JCPOA. And so I think it's important not to ignore the people that are actually propping up these types of leaders. And so if he has a future, he has a future because the Iranian populace wants a relationship with the United States. They do not want this continued sort of consistent aggression that we're seeing. And so I absolutely think that Zarif has a future beyond just the politics. He has a future because that is what the population of that country wants. And the only other thing I wanted to add, Shireen, you brought up 75 to 79 as when the US made a mistake in Iran. I would push that back a bit further and go to 1953 and say if there is, we have to be able to look at the Iranian perspective on this dichotomy of US-Iran relations as well. And if we're talking about US hegemony, if we're going to bring in US hegemony, then we also have to be cognizant of the fact that if we believe in sovereignty, then any nation state would try to fight that hegemony, and it would naturally do so.
Can I just add one?
I just want to comment. I hope that nobody lost my remark, which I said that Zarif is speaking on behalf of social forces. I spent the better part of 10 years working on precisely the subject of the relationship between the leadership and Iran's social political arena and how the two are linked. And so I want to emphasize that this is in no way an analysis that focuses exclusively on the leadership, as I noted. I do want to return the discussion to the last two questions, which get us back to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, of all places. And that is two related questions for which I'm sure that none of us actually have a good answer. What strategy could help Trump save face? What can be done in that regard? And we've commented on that. And this has been sort of commented on before, and I actually agree in terms of, I think, of what could be the solution. But why doesn't Trump fire his current foreign policy advisor on Iran and try somebody who has views consonant with his, whatever that means? And that's a big question. So I'm going to leave those two questions for our panelists, and we'll wrap up based on that and your responses. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I think that, if the president were to fire particularly John Bolton, that would send a message to a lot of countries around the world that the U.S. policy might be shifting. But, Trump has already had how many national security advisors? This is number 3, right? So, it's a possibility. Another thing that Trump could do is name an envoy for negotiations with Iran. Instead of trying to have a summit before you have negotiations, have the negotiations. And we have a model which came from the Obama administration. The Omanis hosted talks that were private before we got to Zarif bouncing off the walls when he met with Kerry in New York in 2013. Rand Paul is a possible emissary, but there are others. There are a lot of Republicans who have worked with Iran and worked with Iran successfully. Jim Dobbins, who's now at Rand, was in Bonn and got the agreement that put a new government in Afghanistan after the overthrow of the Taliban. Zal Khalilzad, now working on the Afghan file, was our ambassador both at the United Nations and in Iraq. He speaks Dari, which is essentially Farsi, and he knows lots of Iranians. He's very capable. Ryan Crocker, also a very distinguished former diplomat, negotiated with Iranians in Iraq, and he held talks with them after 9/11 that were about how to manage Afghanistan and al-Qaeda and so on. Very capable guy. Jim Jeffrey, our current envoy against ISIS and in Syria, also has had long contacts and experience with the Iranians. The Deputy Secretary of State, a man named John Sullivan, was a young man in Iran during the revolution. His uncle was the last U.S. ambassador in Iran before the revolution. So there's no shortage of individuals. We have an envoy for North Korea. I don't know that he gets to do much because Trump keeps preempting him by meeting Kim Jong-un. But you could go back to that model. You could work behind the scenes. You could have a realistic agenda, not the 12 demands. And you could get somewhere. It's entirely possible if Trump wants to go that route. But we've seen no indication so far that he does.
Anybody else want to fill in on that?
Because it's going to come down to whether sanctions are going to be lifted. That's what
Eased or frozen
this
or-
is what I'm watching for. Is there any indication that they're going to be willing to lift sanctions? And so far, I have not seen it.
May I just say one thing, that it can be, face-saving has to be both for Iran and for United States. Everybody needs a fig leaf to hide behind, and everybody needs to be able, this is the, one of the sort of international negotiations 101. You learn it, that everybody has to get. And one reason the JCPOA was that Iran was in a dire situation. I'm sorry, I dissent when the Iranian says that they did not agree to JCPOA because of sanctions. It's not correct. They did. And I know that for sure. It wasn't the only reason, but it was. The other thing is that, therefore, what can Iran go? I think Zarif made a positive, actually, recommendation, and that was U.S. has been asking Iran to, an Iranian parliament, because Iran has signed it, but the Iranian parliament has not yet ratified it, the additional protocols of the IAEA, which would increase even more than the current inspection and so on that is under JCPOA. In exchange, at least for partial lifting of sanctions. So I think that that will be, President Trump can go, he said that now with this, we know that Iran cannot, produce nuclear weapons, which actually this is pushing an open door, because they have said we will not. And in fact, as somebody put it, NPT even though it's weaker, NPT prohibits all the countries like India and Pakistan, they were not members of the NPT, so therefore they were not bound by the limitations of that. So I think that there are ways of, if there is a will, there is a way to do that. The last thing I would like to add, if I might, because I may not have a nice platform like this, is that there is a moral dimension to all the things that the sanctions are doing to Iran. I mean, essentially, it is killing the country, and I'm talking about even physically killing the country because of unemployment, because of all kinds of other pressures. People are even smuggling fertile soil across the borders and so on. So I think that at some point, it seems to me, to be honest, I was arguing the other day, that having a war might be more merciful, because then you will actually finish it rather than this slow death that is happening. I mean, children don't have drugs, dying of all kinds of peculiar diseases. And there is the one thing that to me is amazing, where we get very upset about certain human rights violations. This is the right to life that is being, for a lot of people, is being violated. And I think that we have to bring this into the, even though I am a realist and I believe, unfortunately, power relations determines, but that doesn't mean that you have to be absolutely immoral in this matters. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question comes down to, from the American position, whether we want to live with Iran or not. I mean, we have to decide what the strategy is. Yeah.
On the question of saving face for Trump, honestly, I think saving face would be not going to war, as silly as that might sound. So the question of saving face is Iran is somewhat calling his bluff, right? He continuously is putting more and more sanctions. As Barbara mentioned, it's just sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. That's all he can sort of do. He's maxed that out to a certain extent, and now he's sanctioning individual people. So it's clear Iran, and I'm not going to get into the entirety of the history right now because it would be ridiculous, but is not going to surrender. It's not going to capitulate. So they're either calling his bluff, and he'll have to go another route, which would be a war, or he has to reel back. And I actually think, given the two options, reeling back saves face. Because for someone who ran a platform criticizing wars, especially wars in the Middle East, to then get into one that is likely exponentially going to be worse than anything we've seen so far, because of the context of Iran and Iraq are not comparable situations at all, then it actually saves him face and sort of a legacy if he can reel back from this and not get into something that can go on potentially for decades, as we've seen in other conflicts.
No, I completely agree with that. A war is not is not a policy that wins much for, apart from all the horrific implications, it wins much for our president domestically. It's a policy of peril, and I think we have to recognize that, and hopefully he does, and he will see his way towards dealing with Iran as opposed to simply sustaining the current status quo, which will take us down a very dangerous path. Thanks to the entire panel for this excellent discussion, and we'll look forward to seeing you another time.